love, but I think other people would like it more if I made it different for them. We don't know what they would like. It's all in our head. It comes back to this thing of what I think isn't good enough. You know, if I like it, that doesn't mean anything. That's what people think. It's like, just because I like it, that doesn't give it any value. Like, as an artist, if you like it, that's all of the value. That's the success comes when you say, I like this enough for other people to see it. Not other people like it, so it's successful. That doesn't mean anything because that's other people liking it is out of your control. All that's in your control is making the thing to the best of your ability. I talk about it usually the way I talk about it is greatness, and that's the way I thought of it. My whole life was my interest is in making something great, greatness, lasting greatness, timeless. And I came to realize recently, it's all an offering to God. And if you're making an offering to God, you're not thinking about, oh, what's the budget? Or I hope this segment of the audience is gonna like it. We don't think like that. It's a higher vibration. We're making the best we can make to the best of our ability out of love and devotion. That's what it is. And there is no, I'm changing it for someone else because it can't be better than this devotional act that we're doing. There is no higher form.
Yeah, and that's what you see so much in nature around us. I've always found like the sun is just selflessly serving and giving, and you see a bush of flowers or you see a tree that's growing fruits, and again it's providing shade and fruit, and it's just serving. And it's interesting how when you call it a devotional act, the idea that it's a service, it's an offering, as you said,
Absolutely.
in that language.
And even an offensive song is that to someone. It's like I worked with band Slayer, and Slayer were a very controversial, aggressive band. And the people who came to see them didn't come to see them filled with hate. They came to see them filled with love. And for many of the people in the audience, maybe the only experience of love they had was connecting over Slayer. You know, there were people in the audience who seemed like, other than this thing to devote themselves passionately to, seemed like often hopeless people. And for them to have something that they love was beautiful to witness.
And that sounds like one, I think you're spot on, that fear of what will people think, what will people say, art versus audience almost. And I feel that has become such a big challenge in today's world because there's so much data available, social media available, and you get instant feedback, right? So I think in the past, a band would lock themselves in a shed or whatever it may be and then work on stuff, and maybe their friends would listen or they would listen, but it would take months before the audience heard it. Today, you could literally record something in 3 seconds, put it up, and get instant feedback. And so the feedback loop has got shorter, the time to create something has got shorter, it's easier to publish, and it's easier to get criticism or feedback. And so in that world, I find us looking so much at like, well, what's the data saying of the trends, of the pace of music, or the frequency of music, or whatever, and that's obviously only music, but you can apply that to anything else. Do you think that obsession in social media, music, movies, of looking at it from a data, even in movies now, I find like we're just taking old IP and remaking stuff. There's very little new IP. You just keep seeing old IP finding its way back into TV and movies. Do you say that that's creativity being stifled and is hampering creativity?
Absolutely. And the beauty of it is, because so much of what's being made is being made that way, that if we choose to make something not like that, it really stands out. This book, for example, it goes against all of the rules of publishing. From the beginning, I started the book 8 years ago, and I met with publishers 8 years ago, told them, this is my vision for this book. And all of them said, that's not the book anybody wants from you. That's not the book. And I said, well, that's the book I want to write.
Yeah.
And like, well, but surely you'll tell personal stories and you'll talk about Johnny Cash and you'll talk about, it's like, no, that's not what this is.
Yeah.
It's a different book.
Yeah.
And then I decided not to make a publishing deal then, because even the ones who said they would go along with what my vision was, I could see that they really were fantasizing a different book than this book.
Yeah.
I waited till the book was written and then said, do you want to publish this book? Not the book you think is the book that you want me to write, but this is the book that I wrote, that I wanted to write and wrote. Do you want to publish this book? And then when they read it, they're like, oh yes, we'll publish this.
That's brilliant. The reason I'm laughing so much is because with my first work, I had thought of the title when I was writing it because it resonated with me because it was playful, but also curious, and it felt true to me. It was the biggest reason why I had chosen the title. It felt like it was true. And so the title I was proposing for my first book was Think Like a Monk. And I'd lived as a monk for 3 years. I'd studied under these incredible monks, and I wanted to share what I'd learned from these masters who'd spent 40, 50 years living as monks. And so the book was almost an offering to them in the way you're saying it, a devotional act back to my teachers and guides. And every publisher was like, Jay, you should just write a book about like how to find your passion, or like, you know, like what you love in life. And I was just like, there's beauty in that. There's nothing wrong with a book about how to find your passion. That's great, but that's not me. Like, it's not my experience. It's not my book. And I remember 14 out of 17 imprints said no to that title.
Yeah.
And we still went with it.
Yes.
And I couldn't be more happier because of that. But you're right, you can't control what the audience wants, even if you played every perfect metric in the game.
No.
But we think we can. We think there's a part of us, and that's what I was going to ask you, that almost one end is saying, I am too worried about what people think. But the opposite almost is the ego of I can either control everything perfectly so that this becomes the #1 chart-topping song, or I'm right and I know everything. Do you see that as a block to creativity, and how and how do you purify that?
I think the goal is to get to this. This is how I see it. I don't know what other people are going to think. I can't know what other people are going to think. But this is how I see it. And I want to show you how I see it. That's my purpose here on the planet, is to show you how I see it. And then I want to see how you see it. And where do they line up and where are they different? And that's how we make sense of the world. It's not one story.
Yeah.
We all have a story. We all have something to say. And we can all learn from each other. And it's fascinating. It's like there are the same set of chords used in all the songs. Yet new songs keep coming. You know, there's someone who say all the songs have been written. It keeps happening. How did new jokes come up? It's like they're all the same, but then they're all different.
Yeah.
And how we interpret it and it comes from each of our life experiences, which are different. We each have our own family origin story. We each have our own places that we grew up, the things that we saw. We could go and do the same thing together and then get back and discuss what we saw and see two completely different things. And it's not like one of us is right, one of us is wrong. We're just noticing different things. There's so many data points to take in, and we each take in the ones that speak to us.
So true. Yeah, you remind me of the famous words of Mark Twain of history never repeats itself, but it always rhymes. And the idea of like the same song doesn't come back, but there's a rhyme, there's the chord, but it's still different. And there's some beautiful. I want to point out to everyone, because I really do want you to get this book. Everyone who's listening and watching right now. And I've like dog-eared some pages that have some really beautiful moments. I really like this because one thing I really aim to do here on the podcast, but also in life, is to try and give people really practical, tiny steps that they could take. And you do that artfully in this book. And there's this section here, which identifies why I brought it up now, because exactly what you said, breaking the sameness, right? And we think there's the sameness or completeness, and you give these beautiful examples of things people can do in order to do that. And I just want to touch on a couple of them.
Please.
And would love to hear some examples from you where it worked. So I really like this one, change the context. So you say, there are times when a singer doesn't connect with a song, like an actor whose line reading falls flat. It can be helpful to create a new meaning or an additional backstory to a song's lyrics. A love song might sound different if sung to a long-lost soulmate, a partner of 30 years that you don't get along with, a person you saw on the street but never spoke to, or your mother. I was intrigued, have you ever asked an artist to sing to someone real in their life, potentially, to get an emotion out?
Yes. There's the first example that comes to mind is we were doing a cover of the song "The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face" with Johnny Cash, and he read the lyrics and he said, "I don't know if I could sing this song. I don't really feel these words." And I said, "Well, how about if it's a devotional song to God?" He's like, "I could sing that song." And when he changed it to being not singing it to a woman, but singing it to God, he was able to tap into the energy of the song, and he felt the vibration. He felt the trueness to him in singing it.
Wow, yeah. And so but everyone still thought the song was about a woman.
It is.
Yeah,
And the song
it is.
about
The song is.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, but there's a long history of songs that are love songs that could be to a woman or could be devotional.
Yeah.
It's interesting when songs walk this line, or when we think we know what a song's about,
Yeah.
and we think it's about a romantic relationship when it's really about their child. You know, these devotional songs.
So, and I'm sharing these with all of you who are listening and watching, because I know what you're sitting there thinking. Jay, I procrastinate, I overthink, I don't know how to focus, which we'll get into all of that. But I want to share these with you because I want you to try them out in your own area and the work you do. So change the environment. If we're looking for a performance of a different nature, it can help to change an element of the environment. Turning off the lights and playing in the dark can create a shift in consciousness and break the chain of sameness from performance to performance. Other shifts we've experimented with include having a singer hold the microphone instead of standing in front of it, and recording early in the morning instead of at night. To access a greater degree of variation, one vocalist chose to hang upside down while singing. Could you tell us some examples of those? Because I find that, again, they're so simple, but we don't do it. We will sit at the same desk every day, banging our head against the wall, with the same tabs open on Google, going, why can't I be creative? And it's often these physical, tangible changes around us.
Yeah. And so it happened in the studio. It's not uncommon if we've played a song 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times, and it just feels like it's not getting better, or we've reached a certain peak, and it's really not all it could be, but then it starts not being as good. Usually when that happens, as soon as you reach whatever peak you're at and it starts coming down, we usually stop playing the song. But one thing we've done in the past also would be, again, changing the contest, turning the lights off in the studio. It changes everything. It's not take 7, it's the first take in the dark. And it changes. The first album I recorded with the Red Hot Chili Peppers was their 5th album. And the albums that they had done before, they had all done in traditional recording studios. And they told me that none of those were good experiences. So we thought about what could we do for this experience to make it the first different one instead of the 5th if the first 4 were bad. Could have been the first good one in the same environment, or we could change the environment and it would be the first of any kind. So we chose to rent this big house not far from here and record in this mansion. And that was very different than studio with people working in an office and other musicians and other places. We had our whole own world that we created, and some of the members of the band didn't leave during the entire, 6 weeks. They never left the premises. They just stayed there, slept there, ate there, worked there, and never left until it was done.
Wow. Yeah, I love that one. Invite an audience. This one makes sense, but I think people need to do it more. When an artist thrives on being in front of a crowd, we may bring in several people to watch a session. Being observed changes how an artist acts. Even if the audience consists only of one person who isn't part of the project, that can be enough. While some artists may overdo a performance for an audience and others may hold back, most tend to be more focused with someone else present. Even if your art is non-performative, such as writing or cooking, it will still likely change with an observer present. The goal is to find the specific parameters in each case that bring out your best. I love the idea. I had a few friends a few years ago. One of their buddies wanted to become a stand-up comic, but he had no experience in stand-up comedy. So they threw him a stand-up show in their backyard, and there were like 15 of us present in the audience. He got announced onto stage in front of an audience that wasn't gonna heckle or be the meanest to him, and he got to practice. And it was just such a beautiful way, A, to do that for your friends, but to experience that. And I'm on tour at the moment, and this is my break period, but for my test, we were practicing, rehearsing in a small theater in Thousand Oaks. And so what the theater said to us is they could throw it out to their local audience members who would have no clue who I was or what I was doing, and they'd come along. Little did I know that we'd have like 50 to 100 people that weekend watching the show just as a rehearsal. And it was so useful to me before I went out, and it was huge, like huge. So I loved that one.
I was listening to a story on the way here. I was listening to a podcast in the car, and it told a story about the Beatles. That when the Beatles were interviewed individually, they were all these thoughtful, interesting, soulful people. But when they were interviewed, even two together, they became sarcastic and never said much about anything real, and was much more of a performative, cool, like to look cool in front of the other one. And just being with each other changed the way that they appeared in the world.
Wow, yeah, that group.
Excuse me.
You just brought another quote that I think would be good for people to hear. Going back to this, it's interesting.
You respect. You like what they do, they like what you do, and being able to share your work back and forth is a really great feeling.
Yeah, how would you? That's a really nice segue. How has that affected how you've learned to filter criticism and feedback? Because again, going back to the world we live in today, because of that instant feedback loop, you can have 100 comments that are negative on social media. Your song didn't make it. It's not as big as the next album. You have the top 10 chart. You didn't make it. I think the way everything's made and broadcasted now can make criticism and feedback in one sense seem louder. Before you went into a room and someone told you you weren't getting a new deal, and no one knew. Today you didn't get a new deal, and the whole world knows, and your fans know, and the opposing fans know. It's messy. It's like, how have you worked enough for yourself and the work you've done, and even the artists that you work with, who I'm guessing may be more sensitive to it, may not have that natural confidence or groundedness in what it is. How do you, and even people who listen today, how do you think about feedback and criticism?
Most of the artists I work with don't read any criticism reviews, and they work good or bad. Most. Some do. And I would say the ones who are the strongest in who they are can even read a terrible review and laugh at it. And that makes sense, because when someone gives you criticism, it's telling you as much about who they are as what you've made. It's like we make things, and then we make it with one through our filter, our perspective. And then you receive it through your filter, with your perspective. So even if we both like it, we probably don't like it the same way for the same reasons. We all have our own relationship to it. Everyone has their own relationship to it. So any of these metrics of which is better, like the idea of the Oscars or the Grammys, where we're saying which album is better than another, it doesn't make any sense to me, because it's always apples and oranges. If you have a Drake and Beyonce, and you're deciding which album's better, well, Drake's album is clearly a better Drake album than Beyonce's album is, and Beyonce's album, I'm sure, is a much better Beyonce album than Drake's album is. But the idea that one's better than the other, it makes no sense. So who has a better diary entry? It's like, if we are actually making these personal things, you can't compare them or compete in any way with anyone else. The only people who we can honestly compete with is ourselves. It's like, is this the best I can make today? Have I gone further than I've gone before? That's all we can do. That's the only competition that makes sense.
Sí.
Is continuing
Yeah.
to evolve and
Oh,
push ourselves artistically and not get complacent, especially in success. It's easy to get complacent once something works. It's like, I'll just keep doing more of that. It ends up maybe one more time you can get away with it. But once 3 are similar, it stops being interesting.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true, and that comes back to that sameness point that we always, and I'm just addressing things that I know all of you are thinking and feeling right now, like, or I'm assuming you are, the idea of, oh, Jay, there's already, when I started making podcasts, I think there were like 700,000 podcasts in the world, and today there's like 2 million plus, maybe even more now, and that's in 3 years, it's tripled. Since I started 4 years ago, it's tripled, and so when I started, everyone's like, Jay, there's 700 podcasts, you don't need another podcast. Too late. Exactly, too late. And then now everyone's like, oh my God, there's 2 million podcasts, like it's too late. And we do that. We start again using a metric to say, and you'll only feel that way if you're planning to repeat what's already been done. Because if you're not planning to repeat it, then you're one of one. You're not one of 2 million or one of 700,000. It's one of one because you're only bringing your own essence out, right? Like, just because every other podcast, you can be like, there's so many interview podcasts. There are so many interview podcasts, that's true.
And they're all different.
And they're all different, exactly. Like, and we got introduced through your long-term friend and my new mutual friend, Andrew Huberman, who's also been a guest on this podcast. It's a phenomenal podcast. I love his podcast. But so different to who I am, so different to what we do. And then there's a million other friends that we have that have shows. So the most common thing I hear when it comes to creativity, when it comes to tapping into your essence is distraction, overthinking, and procrastination. Like those words come up from my community again and again and again. And that's the kind of community listening I do like to do, where I'm like, well, what are people struggling with? Because we're trying to help. What are people's challenges? I have to know from them what they think it is, and then I'll also share in the way I do. Have you or anyone you've ever worked with ever dealt with big bouts of procrastination or overthinking? Yeah, and how do you define it? Because I almost think...
Well, I would say there's two. Distraction and procrastination are related and different. Mm-hmm. Procrastination is not a good one. Distraction can be helpful. You can use distraction if you hold a question to be solved and don't sit and think and try to solve it, but go do something else and go, take a walk or go for a swim. You'll find that it changes. And the distraction of when you go for a walk, it's, oh, look at that tree over there. Look at those birds. Or, whoa, that car came kind of close to me. All of those things, that living in the world, even though it's not challenging in any real way, it's a distraction that's using some part of your brain. Some part of your brain is occupied with, do I turn left or do I turn right? Oh, look at that thing over there.
Yeah.
These other things are happening. That's different than just sitting in a room looking at your laptop. Just those outside cues can give you a way into solving a problem that you wouldn't solve if you were sitting in the dark. For example, if we were now doing this podcast together on a walk, it would be a very different podcast than us sitting here staring into each other's eyes. And it's a beautiful idea. There was a period of time where I lost a whole bunch of weight. And one of the things that I did after that was I only did walking meetings. Before I used to only do lunch meetings. So I switched the lunch meetings to walking meetings. And I would meet people in Santa Monica and we'd walk. And the meetings were so much better than the meetings either in a restaurant or in an office. Everything shifted. Just because we were moving, we were doing something, there were external stimuli, even though the external stimuli had nothing to do with what we were doing, it changed. It was a change in context that really did make the conversation much more interesting. And there's also something about when you're walking, you're not looking at each other, so it's easier to go into your own thoughts when you're not looking at somebody. So it was very interesting, a great experiment. lost a lot of weight, and the meetings were the best they've ever been.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of work in couples psychology that suggests that when couples argue, they're usually sitting on opposite sides of a dining table. And when you're sitting with something in between you, first of all, I mean, here we don't have anything, but you have something in between you, it's already creating a distance. And now you're working against each other, rather than what you're saying, you're walking with each other, and you're looking off into the same direction. So you're almost creating a future. The idea that you're forward, your future forward, your future facing.
My wife and I, whenever we get to a new table and we're sitting to eat, we always say, we look at where the chairs are, and one of us is sitting cheek to cheek. And we tend to sit next to each other instead of across.
There you go. Yeah, cheek to cheek. I love that. And that makes so much sense with leadership meetings, creative meetings. And I love, and this is why this book is so beautiful, because there are many really subtle points in the idea of the difference between distraction and procrastination.
Yes.
And how distraction can actually be healthy. And especially, as you said, when you hold a question, when you hold an idea and you just kind of toying with it, you might pick up a book, you might whatever, you do all these things, but it's almost like you're using that time wisely to come back. And
Absolutely. Going for a drive is a great one.
yeah,
Just paying attention to not crashing. And even though we can drive essentially on autopilot, we're not thinking about driving. Well, once we've been driving for a while.
yeah,
But just driving, ideas come. I know many musicians, singers, who listen to the instrumental music in the car, and then sing along when they're driving, because they're more free than when they're sitting with a recorder.
yeah, absolutely, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, no, and it's so interesting how we have so many, we've also built up, again, going back to our conditioning beliefs, we've built up a negative relationship with the word distraction. We've built up a negative connotation around, if I don't solve it right now, sitting in this one place, then I'm never going to figure it out. And the idea that actually going on a walk, picking up something else, that's one of the reasons why I like having in my office, here in the studio, back in my home, everything's quite minimalist, but I have a lot of like little artifacts and little things, and because I enjoy the kind of like stimulation and the creative juices that start flowing if I get a moment to just observe. And then sometimes I just want to observe nature outside, where I can just sit and bask and almost bathe in nature, which I find to be so useful, because there was this incredible study from MIT a few years ago where they tried to look for who are their most creative, innovative employees inside corporate organizations, and MIT was doing this study. They found two sets of charts of types of employees, employee A and employee B. Employee A knew lots of people that knew each other, and employee B knew lots of people that didn't know each other. And they were looking at which one's more creative, innovative, and hence more imaginative inside a company. And they found it was employee B, because employee A knew people who knew them back.
Small circle,
closed circles that created these echo chambers, and you asked the same 10 people for advice, and employee B knew lots of random people who had no connection to each other, and the point was being made that if your circle, and that I think applies to environment as much as it applies to people,
Iniba ko yung password niyan kasi may nanghak-ngak.
random and disconnected, you have more chance of having a original, authentic thought, idea spark, as opposed to you're surrounded by the four same
Hindi, yung Gmail ko mismo.
Absolutely.
And that to me has always been what I'm trying to do. It's like I want to know what monks think, and I want to know what Silicon Valley thinks, and I want to know what music geniuses think, because there's something there.
Absolutely.
A word you use in this book that I want to touch on, and that's why this came up for me, was submerge. And I loved it. When I saw that word, I was just like, yes, like I love that. I have thought about that for so long. Submerging yourself. We've lost that ability to submerge. We don't submerge ourselves much because we have so much of a little. How have you, in this hyper-connected world, working with the most connected artists in the world, how have you encouraged yourself and others to continue to submerge when everyone's asking us to swim shallow?
I think so many of the great artists do it naturally. You can't help it. It's the obsessive nature of being really into into something that once you start down a thread, you just keep pulling forever if you're interested. Many of the artists that are great at what they do are great at what they do for that very reason. They fall in love with this thing, and then they just want to know everything they could possibly learn about it. And there are no distractions. I'm working on a project now, a documentary project with comedians, and one of the things that they talk about is their commitment. Like when other people are doing things on the weekend and going out with their friends, they're going to perform every night that they can possibly go out and perform until they can get good at their craft. And this could be for a period of, 10 years of just having bad performances, having people not like what you do, like banging your head against the wall. But that obsession with breaking through, and when I say breaking through, I don't mean breaking through to the audience, I mean breaking through with themselves to where they get past all of the blocks and to be free in this moment in a way where they can really express their views and be heard and people can react. It's a fascinating thing.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to ask about being a monk. What can you tell me about your experience?
What would you like to know?
How did you choose to do this first?
I was born and raised in London, and when I was around 18 years old, I started going to events in the city where speakers were invited to come and share their stories or journeys or successes or whatever it may have been. And this is obviously before podcasting, before YouTube, and so you actually went to events to hear people like yourself or anyone speak. And so I would go and listen, and there'd be founders of companies, there'd be athletes, there'd be musicians, people like that would come to universities and colleges in London. And so I'd go, and one of the nights I went, I was invited to hear a monk speak. And I was 18 years old, and I didn't really have a perception of monks. Like I didn't really have any. I'd seen saintly people and holy people coming from an Indian background, but I never really knew what monks were or what they did. And so I said to my friends, I didn't really want to go, but I said I'd only go if we went to a bar afterwards. That was my state of consciousness, age 18. And my friends were very persuasive and convincing. They said, yeah, we'll go. And so I went to this event, kind of like not expecting anything, wanting to leave. And I was just completely like floored. This monk was from India, he was born and raised in India, he had a thick Indian accent, he was wearing saffron robes. And there was nothing externally that I should have found attractive about him as an 18-year-old guy. But his whole message, and that's why I smiled when you said it earlier, like his whole message was that the greatest thing you can do in the world, or greatness, is to use your gifts in the service of God and use your gifts in the service of humanity as a devotional act. And he was talking about how living in devotion. And my 18-year-old self was just completely like mesmerized by that idea. I was just like, I've never heard this. Like everyone's been telling us how to be successful and how to start a business and how to launch a company and how to become number one. And it was like this guy was just saying that wasn't it. And so I went up to him, as you do after an event when you're blown away by a speaker, and I just said to him, I was like, I just want to follow you around. Like, I just want to spend time with you and learn from you and sit at your feet and just observe. And he said, well, I'm doing all these events in London this week, you can come. So I would go along, and then that turned into during college, that turned into my summer and Christmas vacations being with him. And then when I graduated, I turned down my corporate job offers and actually went and lived there for 3 years. And so it was like all these little steps up to like this very big decision. And so that's why it was just one person who I've just always been fascinated by people that you meet that can change the trajectory of your life. And the reason why I do this show is because I want to introduce people to people and thoughts that I think will change the trajectory of their life. Because I didn't ever want to be a monk. I didn't think I'd become a monk. I didn't crave it. It wasn't a path I saw for myself. But it became the best thing that ever happened to me at that time. And now I live in gratitude. But I also realized, so I always ask people, who's your monk? Like, who's the person you need to meet that you haven't met yet that could change your life?
There's an example in the book of people say, I'm not a good artist, or You're either living as an I say you're either living as an artist or you're not living as an artist. You're not good at it or bad at it. It's like being a monk. You're either living as a monk or you're not living as a monk. You can't be a bad monk. If you're living as a monk, you're a monk.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, you've had so much, even today,
Aray mo din yung tubig,
and that's
ha?
why I was excited to meet you in person, because you have such a spiritual journey and essence in just in spirit, even in just your presence and what you talk about, the vocabulary you have there. Where did that
Binigay ko ba sa'yo yung relo mo?
infused?
Ayun na yung relo mo.
Like, has that always been there, or what was your journey?
I learned to meditate when I was 14, and that's turned into a big part of my life. I stopped meditating when I went to college, and then when I moved to California, I started again. And when I started again, I realized, oh, even though I hadn't done it for the last 5 years, a big part of who I am is because I did it when I did it. Had I not stopped, I wouldn't have recognized that. So stopping and starting was a very clear, wow, this is a big part
Hindi ka na rito
of
kasi
how I see
lalagyan mo ng
the
ano yung hair
world
mo.
already, even with not doing it
Hindi
for
pa
the
tapos
last 5 years.
makilang
What type of meditation is it, and how do you...
TM.
TM, oh, perfect. Okay, got it,
I
yeah.
learned TM, changed my life. But since then, I've learned Vipassana, and I
Yes.
do many different practices, and breathing practices, and Tai Chi, and many different meditative practices.
Sige na.
I often come back to TM maybe because it was first.
Yeah,
And it's
Okay.
beautiful.
yeah,
It's beautiful.
absolutely.
Saan ka ba? Saan ka na?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to
Pinunasa mo
me,
na yung ano?
meditation just seems to be...
Parang kung pumunta ka dun para
There was
kunwari yung ano.
definitely a generation where
Punasan mo
meditation
yung
became
sapatos.
really prominent in the lives of so many, especially so many people today
Punasan mo na
that
dalhan mo.
you meet that are doing, Ray Dalio has been on the podcast
Punasan mo yung ano mo.
a million times, and again, he
Huwag
talks
mo
about
siya
trading
napilahin.
as a big part of his financial success in terms of making wise financial investment decisions, and he's a special human as well. I feel like that resurgence is back now, where there's so much more talk about breathwork and meditation. If you had any words of wisdom or insight for anyone who's trying it, experimenting, what would you suggest to someone who's done it for so long, had breaks, found usefulness in it? Are there any things that come to your heart or forefront of you?
The first thing that comes up, there's a beautiful book called Wherever You Go, There You Are. I love that book. I had meditated a long period of time before I read it, but I remember reading it feeling like, this is the best meditation and reminder of the power of meditation, regardless of where you are in your meditative journey. So I would recommend that book as a way in, and find a practice that works